Greetings, my friends. Let the circle be unbroken. Chapter 7. Looks like the rain's letting up. I turned as Papa climbed the porch steps and came over to the swing. He sat down beside me, making the chain supporting the swing creak wearily. Yes, sir? For a while he said nothing as he stared out at the field, and then he looked around at me. I hear you and your Uncle Hammer had words. No, sir. We ain't had no words. He done all the talking. Papa was quiet as he gazed out at the greening lawn. You understand what he was talking about? I didn't answer right away. Well, I think so, most of it. But Papa, Uncle Hammer, he didn't have to go burn Jeremy's picture that way. He didn't have to. He didn't understand about Jeremy. He understood all right. Jeremy's a white boy. You got no business with his picture. Papa's voice was harsh. I stared at him, surprised. Usually he understood the things that Uncle Hammer didn't. You think I'm being hard about Jeremy? I lowered my eyes, not daring to answer. Well, I ain't. Jeremy seems to be a right fine boy. Maybe he'll grow up to be a right fine man. But you can't never forget that he's white and you're black. You forget it and you're likely to find yourself hurt. He paused. You remember me telling y'all about Grandpa and how he come to leave Georgia and come to Mississippi? I remembered very well. Grandpa Logan had been born as a slave on a Georgia plantation. He was 2 years old when freedom came. Yes, sir. His mama died, and he didn't want to stay there no more. I ever tell you about his daddy? I frowned, trying to remember. He was the plantation owner. Now, what'd that tell you? Sir? What'd that tell you about your grandpa's daddy? I thought of the large picture of Grandpa which hung over the fireplace. In it, the straightness of his hair, the pale coloring of his skin, distinctly showed his mulatto heritage. He was a white man, I answered. Papa nodded. A white man that kept slaves. Owned them like you own cows or a pig. And the slave women had to do what he said. And that's how your grandpa came to be born. Your great-grandmama didn't have no say about it. No say at all. White men been using colored women for centuries. They still doing it. And believe me, it's a mighty hurting thing. Mighty hurting. And I feel just like your Uncle Hammer do about it. Anytime I see a colored woman with a white man, a colored woman who wants to be with that white man, it makes me want to cry, 'cause that woman don't care nothing about herself or how that white man looked down on her and her folks. You understand that? Yes, sir. Papa breathed in deeply, looking at the lawn, then back at me. The hardness was gone from his eyes. Cassie. Soon, too soon for you, old Papa. Boys gonna start wanting to court you. Oh, Papa, I sighed. I had heard that before from Big Ma, and the thought of it depressed me. Not that I didn't like boys. I liked them just fine. In fact, as friends, they had always proven closer friends than any girls I had known. But for that fine relationship, which had taken years to build up, to suddenly be ruined because of a foolish change in the way of things, was something to which I was not looking forward. Papa smiled. I know what you're thinking, sugar, but it's gonna happen. And when it does, you'll be happy enough about it. His smile faded. Trouble is, there's gonna be white boys looking at you too, for no good. But they'll be looking. I don't want you looking back. I glanced up at Papa and then out to the field again. I wanted to ask him about Cousin Bud and how he come to marry a white woman, but was unsure whether I should. Papa was watching me. You won't ask me something? Well, what about Cousin Bud? I mean, he went and married that white woman. Papa sighed and rubbed his mustache. Well, I tell you, it ain't something I would have ever done, but who knows? Maybe that's the way things will be naturally one day. I ain't saying I want to see it, not with how they treat us, but sometimes I get to thinking about your mama's folks and the folks on my side of the family. Your mama's grandmama was a full-blooded Indian, and here my granddaddy was a white man. I ain't had no say about my white granddaddy, and your mama ain't had no say about her Indian grandmother. Ain't none of us got no say about our past. They just part of us now, no matter if we like it or not, and that's that. I suppose all folks is mixed up some kind of way, white folks and black folks and red folks, and when we dead and gone, it don't make a speck of difference to the folks that's dead, only to them that's left behind. Maybe in 50 or 100 years, folks won't even have to think about it. Whether you're black or white, way it seems now, it ain't likely, but maybe. Right now, though, it does. It makes a whole lot of difference. And we can't turn our backs on it. There's colored folks and there's white folks. They don't want nothing to do with us except what we can do for them. And Lord knows I don't want nothing to do with them. They leave us alone, we leave them alone. And it wouldn't worry me one bit if a whole year gone by and I wouldn't have to see a one of them. But Papa, what about Mr. Jameson? Papa considered. Well, Mr. Jameson, he's a rare man, and I got a lot of respect for him. Far as I can see, there ain't no better man, black or white. I know about that. Yes, sir, Papa. Yes, sir. Papa? Yeah, baby. You think things will change one day? I mean, about how we get treated by the white folks? I sure hope so, Cassie. But white folks ain't just going to change out of the goodness of their hearts. I'll tell you that. It's going to take a whole lot of doing on somebody's part. I frowned, thinking. Papa looked at me. What's the matter? I wonder if they ever think what it'd be like if they was the ones getting treated like us. They ever do, Papa said with a sly smile. I imagine they don't think on it too long. You think they'll be changing anyway soon? I don't know about soon, Cassie girl. But I tell you one thing. I'm sure hoping that if I don't live to see the day, you will. I'm praying right hard on that. Cousin Bud left that evening. It was clear that Mama blamed Uncle Hammer for his going, and she moved moodily around the house, not saying much to anyone. Nothing was said about Cousin Bud that night, but the next morning Uncle Hammer talked to Papa about him. The morning had dawned warmer than the day before, and though there was still a chill in the air, it was not too chilly for us to attend to part of our morning toiletries on the back porch, as we did every morning when the weather was warm. While Christopher, John, and I brushed our teeth, Papa and Uncle Hammer peered into their small oval mirrors hanging from post nails and shaved. "Mary's still upset with me about Bud?" asked Uncle Hammer, adjusting his mirror. Papa slid the straight razor down the side of his face, stripping away the soap lather. "She got a right to be, don't you think?" Uncle Hammer shrugged and began to lather. "Didn't say nothing but the truth." "Thought you wasn't going to say nothing at all." "Wasn't planning to, but it's done now." He finished lathering but hesitated before starting to shave. "What about Mary?" Papa slid the razor down his face once more. "Now you know Mary feel real special about Bud. He's like a brother to her, and she didn't like the way you talked to him. Yeah, she's plenty mad at you, all right. I expect you want to get back on her good side. You best go talk to her." Uncle Hammer glanced over at Papa and nodded. "Yeah, guess I better." By the time the boys and I returned from school, it was obvious that Mom and Uncle Hammer had mended their differences. There was no more talk about Cousin Bud, and the house settled back to normal, though thoughts of Mr. Farnsworth still bothered us. With each day, we heard more talk around the community about the beating, but no one really knew how badly Mr. Farnsworth had been injured or who had done it. There were some who speculated privately about it, yet as far as we knew, no one but the boys and I actually seen the beating. And even had we recognized the men, we certainly wouldn't have said so. As the week wore on and no one approached us about it, we assumed that no one knew about us, and we all began to relax a little. On Saturday morning, we went to the fields. Through the week, as the boys and I had reluctantly gone off to school, last year's cotton stalks had been thoroughly broken, the ground tilled, and then laid into rows about 3 feet apart. Now it was time to sow the cotton seeds. As Papa drove Jack over the length of the field, pulling the planter, a plow-like implement with a small container attached that cut the earth, then dropped seeds along the opening and covered them. The rest of us came behind, covering any seeds left uncovered, and packing the dirt snugly over them. We worked well throughout the morning and were nearly ready to break for dinner at noon when Sheriff Hank Dobbs drove up and stopped on the road. Stepping from his car along with another man, he parted the barbed wire and both came onto the field. "How y'all doing?" he called. "Sheriff," said Papa, who had by now halted Jack and was waiting for him. Uncle Hammer, standing in the next row, was leaning on his hoe. The sheriff's eyes shifted to him. "Hammer didn't know you was back." Uncle Hammer wisely kept quiet and only nodded. "Be here long?" "Ain't decided yet." Sheriff Dobbs kept his eyes on Hammer a moment longer, then gestured to the man beside him. "This here's Mr. Peck. He's going to be the new county agent. Peck, this here's David, Brother Hammer. Wife, Mary, and Mama over yonder." Mr. Peck was a nervous-looking man with a pale cast about him, which made me guess that he was new to all this. He nodded cautiously. Pop and Uncle Hammer did the same. "I suppose by now you heard about what happened to Mr. Farnsworth," said Sheriff Dobbs. "About him getting beat up and all." "Heard some talk," Papa said. "In all this talk you heard about who done it?" Papa shook his head. "Can't say I have." "Well, I tell you, David, I know it wasn't none of y'all. Mr. Farnsworth, he says it was a white man done it to him. Seems like he felt he had to say that, though he ain't said no more than that. Won't tell us who it was. But I'm telling everybody that Mr. Peck here is under my protection. Mr. Farnsworth, he's going to be laid up a right long spell, and I ain't having none of the kind happening to Mr. Peck. One hair on this man's head gets mussed, and I'm personally going to thrash the living daylights out of whoever mussed it." This declaration did very little to improve Mr. Peck's nervousness as he looked around uneasily and spotted Mr. Morrison in the distance. "I figure this kind of stuff's happening 'cause of this union business," Hank Dobbs continued. "These here outside folks coming down in here stirring things up like we don't have worries enough with the hard times and all. I understand a couple of 'em been going around everybody white and colored talking about this union mess. Mr. Granger don't like it. Mr. Montier and Mr. Harrison, none of 'em. Just got everybody riled up, and this beating of Mr. Farnsworth is just the beginning of it. Socialist conspiracy. That's what it is, socialist conspiracy." He looked at Papa as if expecting him to agree that indeed was what it was. When Papa made no comment, He turned to go with Mr. Peck close behind. A few steps away, he stopped again. By the way, David, y'all know a fella named Willis? Jake Willis, I believe his name is. Knifed another colored boy in a card game last night, and I figure I better put him in jail a few days. I ain't gonna have a lot of niggers cutting themselves up round here. Uncle Hammer straightened, pulling away from the hoe. The movement was not lost on the sheriff, who looked over at him. Papa glanced at Uncle Hammer and said flatly, without emotion, "Name ain't familiar." The moment lingered as the sheriff and Uncle Hammer kept their eyes on each other. Then the sheriff nodded at Papa and without another word went back across the field with Mr. Peck. As the two drove away, Papa said, "What'd you say that fellow's name was at church got you on your wrong side?" Uncle Hammer smiled. "Jake Willis." "That's what I thought. By the way, I've been thinking about maybe letting Morris Wheeler have his meeting here. What you think?" Uncle Hammer took a moment, pursed his lips, and said, "You sure you won't do that?" "Figure it won't hurt to listen." "Well, they have to meet someplace, but I was you, I'd choose the folks to come." Papa nodded and turned back to his planting. The meeting was held 2 nights later, and the people who came were all people we knew very well. The Laniers, the Averys, the Ellises, and Mrs. Annie Leanne, and the Shorters. They all came all in one wagon or by foot, so that anyone passing by would not be prompted to wonder about several wagons dotting the drive. When they arrived, they slipped quietly in to listen to Morris Wheeler and John Moses, while outside Mr. Morrison stood guard in case someone came along who shouldn't. As the meeting got underway, the boys and I were sent off to another room. But we soon cracked open the door to listen, and though both Mama and Papa saw us, they did not make us close it. The union men spoke in more detail about the union they proposed, what they planned to achieve, and how they planned to achieve it. Once they had said all they had come to say, and all the questions people were willing to put to them had been asked and answered, they left. But the others stayed a while longer, talking into the night about all that had been said, and from what I could gather, mostly everyone thought the union to be a good thing. The drawback, however, was the risk involved and the fact that no one could bring themselves to trust the white farmers of the area, or even Morris Wheeler. There had been too many years of distrust, too many years of humiliations and beatings and lynchings and inequalities. They would wait, they decided, and see what happened. A few days before Uncle Hammer was to leave, Papa leaned against a back porch post, his eyes on the newly plowed field. Christopher, John, and I, finishing up the supper dishes, watched him standing there, and when Mama came to join him, we grew silent. We knew something had been bothering Papa, and although no one had spoken of it, we all knew what it was. "You're going back to the railroad, aren't you?" Mama said. Stacey came in from the dining room, and hearing Mama's question, stopped to listen as well. Papa turned to her. The answer was on his face. "I knew it. Mary, what you want me to do? I've been to every place I can think of, and they ain't been no work. They say there'll be work when they start building at the hospital. Baby, we can't count on that. You know we can't take a chance of coming up short come tax time. I got a job I can go to, then I gotta go." Mama's voice rose. "And what about next year and the year after that? The children are growing so fast, and they need you here. Look at Stacey, nearly 14. He needs you, David. They all need you." Papa spoke sharply. "And don't you think I know that? But they need other things, too. They need this land. Long as we've got this land, we've got something. Something most folks ain't. And we can't risk losing it. David, just don't go this year. We'll find another way to get the money. Well, you tell me what other way there is. Hammer put in $20. Most likely went without just to give it to us. We'll figure it all out again. See if there's something we can't do without sale. Papa sighed wearily. We've done that already. Mama was silent a long time. Then quietly she said, Maybe you like being a single man on the railroad. Mary. Mama moved away from Papa and started down the porch. Papa stopped her, turning her to him. Mary, now you know that ain't so. I know, she said, just as quietly as before. There was a pause. When are you going? Figured to leave Saturday with Hammer. Mama looked toward the drive. I think I'll go walk down to the pond. I'll go with you. No, David, I know you're doing what you think's best, but I can't help how I feel. I just can't help it. Her eyes lingered on Papa a moment longer. Then she turned and walked along the giant stepping stones leading to the drive. Stacey turned abruptly and left through the dining room. Big Ma, who'd been mixing bread dough at the dining room table, brought the dough into the kitchen and plopped it into a waiting bowl. She covered the bowl with a damp towel, wiped her hands, and went out to the porch. Son, she said, touching Papa's arm. Son, now you know I ain't never come messing nothing between you and Mary, and I ain't wanting to do it now. But you knows I love Mary much as I do you, and me being a woman, I understands how she feels. You been leaving her a lot these here last few years to bring them children up by herself and take care of this place. I know you ain't wanting to do it, and Mary, she knows it too, but she got a right to expect you to be here. Now, Mama, Papa said, his voice sounding tired, don't you start in on me too. I ain't gonna start in on you. All I'm saying is you gotta understand how she feel, and maybe you can try and make it up to her some way, like coming home more times than you done before. That'd make her feel better. Sure would me. And you just remember how special she is. Christopher John dropped a spoon on the floor, and Big Ma looked over her shoulder, realizing that we were listening to every word. She took Papa's arm and walked with him out into the yard to the old bench under the walnut tree. As they crossed the yard, Christopher John said, You suppose Papa's gonna ever be able to stay? I shrugged. Maybe. Someday. Christopher John took a plate from the rinse water and slowly dried it. Cassie, know what? I looked at him. I don't think I can wait that long. Saturday was a lonely day. The boys and I stuck close to Papa and Uncle Hammer for most of the morning. But in the afternoon, when Papa and Mr. Morrison and the boys went down to see about dynamite, I stayed behind, sitting on the back porch steps, staring out across the pasture, wondering if the time would ever come when Papa would not have to go away. Now, what you doing sitting out here all by yourself? I looked around. Uncle Hammer was standing in the kitchen doorway. I was just thinking. He closed the door and crossed the porch to the water pail hanging on a rafter nail. Filling the dipper with water, he drank slowly, then walked over to where I was sitting and leaned against the post. I imagine you most likely thinking about your Papa leaving. That right? Yes, sir. He didn't say anything else for several minutes, and I figured that he was lost in his own thoughts, forgetting I was even there. I wanted to move to another place, for I felt uncomfortable with Uncle Hammer standing there. But I couldn't just get up and walk away without saying something, and since I couldn't think of anything to say, I just sat there. You know, he said finally, making me start at the sound of his voice. I recall one time when my Papa went off for a spell. Not as long as your papa has to go off for, but it was long enough. He was doing some lumbering up near the Natchez Trace, and David and me, we was fit to be tied. We missed him so. Him and our oldest brother, your Uncle Mitchell, was up there trying to get money together to get themselves a horse and pay on this place. Couldn't wait for them to get back here. He smiled at the remembrance, then stood and waved toward the horseshoe stake out in the yard. How about a game of horseshoes with me? I looked at him, then went to get the horseshoes from where they were hooked over a spike on the other end of the porch. You know, I used to be right good at this, he said, walking to the pitching line. Your papa and me, we was two of the best shots at Great Faith when we was boys. We tossed around and Uncle Hammer won. I started the second round with a shot that nicely zinged around the stake and stayed put. Uncle Hammer held his shoe but didn't throw it. You know, Cassie, you ain't had much to say to me this time since I've been here. He was sure right about that. I glanced up at Uncle Hammer and, finding his eyes on me, immediately looked away again. I had made it a point not to say too much to him. In fact, I had stayed out of his way as much as possible, for I wasn't about to put myself in the path of his anger again. One thing I wasn't was stupid. Your papa told me he thought you was kind of upset with me. That right? I kept my eyes riveted on the horseshoe I had successfully thrown and didn't answer. Cassie? I was afraid Uncle Hammer would hear my heart beating. I looked up at him. Look here, sugar. Don't you know you got no need to ever be scared of me? He paused, gazing softly down at me. Again I looked away. I know I ain't the easiest person to get along with. Maybe sometimes I speak too rough to y'all. But don't you know I wouldn't never do nothing to hurt you, and I wouldn't never tell you nothing I didn't think was right. You know that, don't you? He waited patiently, expecting me to answer. Yes, sir. Uncle Hammer glanced at his horseshoe and tossed it. It landed squarely on top of mine. He wasn't looking at me when he spoke again. Ain't got no children of my own. Probably never will have. But even if I did, I couldn't love 'em no more than I love you, Christopher John, Little Man, and Stacey. Y'all ever need me, y'all know there ain't nothing in this world I wouldn't do for y'all that I thought was right. Nothing. Y'all like my own children to me. Neither of us looked at the other. Our eyes were on the stake. I wanted to throw my arms around Uncle Hammer and hug him, but that wasn't the way it was between Uncle Hammer and me. I hugged him when he arrived, and I hugged him when he left. Hugging him at any other time would have been awkward, even now. Instead, I threw another horseshoe, and Uncle Hammer threw his. He said no more about what had happened between us or about his feelings, but he didn't need to. He had said enough. After dinner, Papa and Uncle Hammer prepared to go. Big Ma, who had spent a good part of the morning frying chicken and sweet potato turnovers for them to take, took the lunch boxes to the car and placed them gently on the back seat. By the time she came out, the boys and I were already standing with Uncle Hammer and Mr. Morrison near the barn, the coming loneliness already hanging over us. A few minutes later, Papa and Mama came out, and the goodbyes began. Once Uncle Hammer had shaken Mr. Morrison's hand and hugged the rest of us, he neatly folded his suit jacket across the middle of the front seat and got in the car. Papa, having hugged us all, kissed Mama one last time and followed. But before he closed the door, Little Man, with his huge tears welling in his eyes, tugged at his arm. Papa, do you gotta go? Every year the question was the same. Every year Papa had to explain once again. Papa looked softly at Little Man, then cupping his thin face in his large rough hands said, Now, son, I'm afraid I do, or how else we gonna pay these taxes? and keep this land. You know I ain't wanting to leave, don't you? Little man nodded. We all got a job to do. My job is to see about getting back on the railroad and try to get us some cash money. Your job is to grow strong and help your mama and Big Ma and Mr. Morrison here while I'm gone. Now I'm going to be counting on you to do that. You think you can?" With a sniffle, which he tried to conceal, little man said he could. Then Papa held him close, smiled sadly at the rest of us, and with a wave, closed the door. "Y'all take care of yourselves now," Big Ma called as the Ford pulled away. "And drive careful." Before the car had turned on into the road, little man fled up the drive to the barn to hide his tears. Mama started to go after him, but Mr. Morrison stopped her. "Let me, Miss Logan," he said. As Mr. Morrison went up the drive, Big Ma followed, the spring suddenly gone out of her steps with both her sons gone. But Mama, Stacey, Christopher John, and I remained by the road, watching the car until we could see it no longer. As the swirls of red dust settled back to the earth, we crossed the lawn and headed for the house, still hearing the hum of the Ford's motor, faint, distant, too far away. Papa and Uncle Hammer were really gone now. It would be too long before they came again. "I thinks I wants to vote," announced Miss Leanne one rainy afternoon in mid-April as she sat with Big Ma and me in front of the fire finishing a patchwork quilt started in the winter. Big Ma looked sharply across at her old friend. "Say what?" "You heard me. Said I was going to vote." Big Ma's fingers moved deftly over the patch that had once been a part of little man's trousers to make sure it hadn't puckered. "Lord of mercy, Leanne, you gone foolish in your old age." "No, I just wants to vote. Done made up my mind." "But Miss Leanne, you said you didn't want to vote," I reminded her, as I took this opportunity to put aside the quilting which had been forced upon me by Big Ma as one of those things young ladies need to learn. "You said you just wanted to read that Constitution." "Well, that's the truth, all right, sugar. But I just been thinking, now's I'm learning the law, why shouldn't I just go on down and vote just like them white folks?" "You done gone foolish," Big Ma said again. "Probably knows it better than a lot of them," Miss Leanne continued unperturbed. "My papa voted, said it was a right fine feeling. He voted, and he didn't know no law at all, excepting that he was a free man, and a free man could vote. And here I just been reading the Constitution, and I ain't voting at all." "You've been reading too much, that's what you've been doing," Big Ma retorted. "Well, I'm going to do it, Caroline. Gonna vote, so is. Where that Mary?" "Oh, you Mary, where you at?" Mama came in from the kitchen, and Miss Leanne told her what she had told us. Mama glanced from Miss Leanne to Big Ma. "Don't you look at me," Big Ma said. "I done told her she was crazy round here talking about she free and she gonna vote, like she got somebody to vote for." Mama came back to the circle and took her seat, but she didn't pick up the quilt. Instead, she put her hand on Miss Leanne's arm. "Now, Miss Leanne," she said, "why you want to do this thing? You know these people aren't going to let you vote." "I knows what I got to do to take that test," Miss Leanne continued stubbornly, pounding her knee through the heavy quilt for emphasis. "I got to have my poll taxes paid, and they gonna be Russell give me the money, and I gotta tell the registrar what them there words in the Constitution mean, and I gonna be able to do that. Then I can vote." "Miss Leanne, how many colored folks you know vote?" "Ne'er one. But part of that's 'cause these old white folks think ain't no colored folks gonna come down to their old voting places to vote. Well, this here old auntie gonna strut down right down there and show them I knows the law. Oh, Lee's gonna vote just like her daddy done." "Now, Miss Leanne, Annie Lee's, that's about the silliest thing I done heard of, Big Ma exclaimed in exasperation. Now just who you think you gonna vote for if they lets you vote? Bilbo? Huh, grumped Miss Leanne. Miss Leanne, Mama said, Now have you thought about what could happen if you try to register? First of all, they most likely won't even let you, and even if they do, they won't pass you on the test, but they'll remember you tried to vote, and they won't think too kindly of you for it either. That ain't what I'm living for these crackers to think kindly of me. Mama smiled and nodded. But more than that, have you thought of what Harlan Granger might say? Miss Leanne looked surprised. Harlan Granger? What he got to do with it? Mama took Miss Leanne's hand. You're living on his land, and he expects certain things. And I gives him to him, too. Works my land, puts in my crops alongside Paige and Leora every year. Yes, ma'am, I know that, but... And he knows it, too. Yes, ma'am, but Harlan Granger doesn't expect you to go off trying to vote, and he's not going to like it, not one little bit. For the first time, Miss Leanne was silent. He's not going to care, Mama continued, about your papa or your dreams. All he's going to care about is that one of his colored people is trying to do something he figures is white folks' business. And believe me, Miss Leanne, I know that man. When he doesn't like something, that means there's going to be trouble for you. Things could happen. Miss Leanne was thoughtful, one hand fingering the quilt, the other still held by Mama. She remained unspeaking for so long that Mama finally said, Miss Leanne? Miss Leanne looked back at Mama. Mary, child, all my life, whenever I wanted to do something and the white folks didn't like it, I didn't do it. All my life I've been that way. But now I's 64 years old, and I figure I's deserving of doing something I wants to do, white folks likes it or not. And this old body wants to vote, and like I done said, I got my mind made up. I's gonna vote, too. Mama patted her hand. Promise me you'll think about what I said. I'll think about it all right, but it ain't gonna change my mind none. What I really wants, though, is for you to help me, you and Cassie. What Cassie and me ain't learned, you can teach us. Will you do that for me, sugar? Miss Leanne, I said I'd think about it, ain't I? But I still wants your help. Mama puckered her lips and sighed. You think about what I said, and you think hard now. And you gonna help me? It's against my better judgment. But you will? Mama shook her head, allowing a frustrated laugh. I suppose. Good, said Miss Leanne, smiling brightly and picking up her quilting. Miss Leanne did not change her mind. The most devoted of students, she listened intently to Mama's explanations of the Constitution and laboriously attempted to commit them to memory. There were nearly 300 sections of the Constitution, and Miss Leanne wanted to know each and every one of them. Already she could quote many of them word for word, but it was the understanding she needed and was determined to have. Her enthusiasm for learning was in fact so strong that it proved contagious, affecting Big Ma, Mr. Tom B., and even me. Ain't gonna vote, but I guess it ain't gonna hurt me none to know some of that stuff, Big Ma had decided as she sat with Miss Leanne, Mama, and me around the dining room table. Now, Mary child, what you say that business about them courts being open to everybody was? Mr. Tom B., who was often at Miss Leanne's when Mama and I went there, was more indirect about his interest. He sat through a number of the sessions, seemingly uninterested, whittling on a piece of wood, as Mama explained the sections, and Miss Leanne attempted to understand. None of us thought he had paid any attention to anything that was going on until one afternoon when Miss Leanne was trying, with difficulty, to explain to Mama what jurisdiction meant, and he suddenly exclaimed, "No, no, Leanne, don't you remember? What you talking about is a jury. Jurisdiction tells you who got the power in a thing." We all looked at him in amazement. "You sure you won't join us over here, Brother B?" Mama invited. "Ah, no, ma'am, Miss Logan. I's fine right where I is." But despite his feigned lack of interest, Mom and I both noted that more and more often he was at Miss Leanne's when we arrived, and on several occasions even accompanied Miss Leanne down to our house for the lessons held there. "That Tom B don't be he bothered you none sitting off to himself whittling when you be teaching?" asked a vexed Big Ma after one of the sessions. "He do me, pretending he ain't paying no attention, but always ready to correct a body if she ain't said the right answer." Mama smiled, aware that Mr. Tom B's correcting Big Ma 3 times during the afternoon had not exactly sat well with her. "Not at all. I love it." As for me, under Mama's instruction, I suddenly found the dry words of the Constitution beginning to take meaning. Mama explained that a number of the laws were quite good and in theory quite fair. The problem, however, was in the application, and that if the judges and the courts really saw everyone as equal instead of as black or white, life could have been a lot pleasanter. Mama said that maybe one day equal rights would be for everyone, but as far as she could see, that day was still a ways off. I personally hoped that it wasn't as far off as she made it sound. I figured that before I died, I'd like to enjoy a little of that liberty and justice in the Constitution kept talking about myself. And I didn't intend to be 64 when I did either. By the first week of May, the young shoots of cotton were up, and we had gone through the back-breaking chore of chopping and our first weeding. More than anything, I hated weeding. It was sweaty, tiring work, which was unending, for no sooner had we pulled the weeds from the last row of all 3 fields than we found more had worked their way into the first rows. Each morning, before the color of the land had changed from pre-dawn gray to the emerald brilliance of spring, we had already eaten breakfast and were finishing the last of the morning chores. By the time the sun itself peeped over the horizon, we were in the fields bending and pulling. As May wore toward June and the field work continued, news that work was soon to begin at the hospital building site spread through the community. When the work announcement became official, men, both black and white, gathered at the old Huntington farm where the hospital was to be built, sleeping long nights on the hard ground to be ready as soon as the call to work came. You ever think about seeing about working up there yourself?" Stacey asked little Willie when he learned that Mr. Wiggins had gotten on at the site. We were sitting on the Wigginses' back porch eating roasted peanuts. Little Willie popped a peanut into his mouth before answering and shook his head. "Naw, why would I? All the men up there, what chance I got?" He looked questioningly at Stacey. "What, you thinking to get on?" "He might be thinking it," I said, reaching into the pan, "but that don't mean nothing long as Mama ain't." Stacey glared at me as if I were the burden of his life. But I paid no attention as I went on eating. "I figure it wouldn't hurt to try," he said. "S'pose not," agreed little Willie. He popped another peanut into his mouth. "You want to go over there?" Stacey stared out at the gloom of the drizzling day and decided that he would. Then, along with little Willie, tried to persuade the rest of us to stay behind. But, since we were having none of that, they finally gave in, and after telling Mrs. Wiggins we were going for a walk, we crossed the north field to the forest beyond. Coming to Soldiers Road, we walked the half-mile down to the Huntington place. As we approached it, a newly painted sign with large black lettering, oddly out of place among the ferns and weeds already coiling around its legs, loomed on the left side of the road. On the sign was printed, "Proposed site of the Spokane County Memorial Hospital." I looked around. Only the forest was visible. "Well, where is it?" Stacey nodded past the sign. "Must be that road there." What Stacey had politely called a road was no more than a wagon trail. We went up it, our bare feet caking with the red mud, and soon saw what had once been the Huntington's house, a gray clapboard dwelling with tin roof, now being used in an office for the site. Standing in front of the building in an orderly single file were over 100 men, all of them white. Little Willie pointed to the side of the house. "Papa say they got the hiring place for colored round there." Following Little Willie's lead, we passed the men and went around to the right. The line there was just as long, with men standing patiently, unable to sit because of the muddy ground. To our surprise, Dubé Cross was in the line. "Hey, this is where you been keeping yourself?" Little Willie asked. "Ain't hardly seen you round no place these last few weeks." Dubé shook his head. "Just come up here yesterday. Been spending time with Mr. Wheeler and Mr. Moses with the union." Stacey's brow furrowed. Dubé noticed it. "That's right. I figures that's the only way folks like me gonna get anywheres." Stacey chose not to get into a conversation about the union, and instead looked back down the line at all the men gathered. "You figuring you gonna be able to get on here?" "Gonna try." They hiring less than 16." "They hiring less than 16? "Don't know. You most likely got to ask Mr. Crawford about that." "Most likely you get hired," said Little Willie. "You got the muscles." He looked out at the fields where groups of black men were working under the direction of white leaders. "You seen my papa anywheres?" "Got work early on this morning, pulling stumps." "Where about we find this Mr. Crawford?" Stacey asked. Dubé looked around and pointed to the edge of the yard. There go yonder with Mr. Harrison." We wished Dubé luck and headed toward the two men, but before we reached the end of the line, Jake Willis stopped us. Smiling broadly, the two gold teeth clearly visible, he said, "Well, look-a-here. Y'all Logan young'uns, ain't ya? I reckon y'all don't 'member me, now do ya? But I 'members y'all, all right. 'Members the whole family." "We remember you," Stacey said without enthusiasm. Jake Willis laughed. "Well, ain't that something? Yeah. What y'all doing out here? Job hunting?" "Little Willie's father's here. He's working up yonder in the field," Stacey said, slyly skirting the truth. "You don't say!" Jake Willis glanced out at the field. "Well, seem everybody get lucky but me, and I don't never get lucky. Been out here since 6 o'clock, ain't got nothing." He turned back to us with a laugh. "Ain't gonna get no packers that way, now am I?" Stacey put a hand on my shoulder to urge me on. "We gotta go." "Well, anyways, it was good to see y'all. I'm glad y'all ain't got out here job hunting, too. For a moment there, I was thinking I was going to have to fight for my job against a Logan. Thought maybe things had gotten so bad for y'all. Maybe y'all had been sent out for hire." He laughed, then a raucous, distasteful laugh, and Stacey pushed us on. "That man, I don't like him much," Christopher John admitted as we walked away. "You ain't the only one," I said. "Look here, Stacey," Little Willie said as we neared Mr. Harrison and Mr. Crawford. "You want to do the talking? Don't matter to me. Okay, then you go ahead." When we reached the two men, Mr. Harrison, a white-haired man in his 70s, whose plantation bordered our land to the west, took the time to speak to us. Mr. Crawford, however, tall, weathered-looking, and occupied with both rolling a cigarette and hollering orders across the field, didn't even see us. Mr. Harrison asked what we were doing there, and Stacey told him. Well, I must say that's right ambitious, he decided, and when Mr. Crawford turned his full attention back to his cigarette, he said, Sam, these here young fellas come to see you about a job. Mr. Crawford glanced over, licked the cigarette paper, and gently sealed it into the roll, locking in the tobacco. How old you be? 14, both of us, answered Stacey, indicating little Willie and himself. We strong, and we can do our share. Mr. Crawford stuck the finished cigarette between his lips and lit it, his eyes on the flame. What kind of job you want? Anything you got. We're willing to do whatever needs doing. This boy Stacey here is a good worker too, Sam, praised Mr. Harrison, with a gentle slap to Stacey's shoulder. Known him and his daddy both since they was born. Known his granddaddy too. All of 'em good, dependable men and fine workers. Mr. Crawford looked across the field to the line of men, nodded at them. You see them men out there? We all looked at the line. Yes, sir, said Stacey. Your daddy in that line? No, sir. He been in it? No, sir. What's he do? Work on the railroad. Mr. Crawford nodded. Then y'all got something. Most of them men there got nothing at all. Mr. Harrison says you a good worker. So I believe that to be so, but I can't go hiring no boy at 14 when there's men out there been waiting months, maybe years, to make some money. Now can I? Stacey looked directly at Mr. Crawford. I thought he was going to agree with him, but instead he said, We all trying to keep from losing what we got. Me no less than them others. Mr. Crawford seemed somewhat surprised by the statement. Glancing at Mr. Harrison, he looked back at Stacey with an appreciation. He waved his cigarette hand at him. Tell you what, this here project's supposed to be keep going the next 5 years. You come back when you get to be 16, and if I'm still here and the money's still coming in, I'll hire you. That's the best I can do. Farley, didn't I tell you them men was supposed to be working on the other side? He turned back to Mr. Harrison. Look here, Henry. I'd better see to this myself. Don't nobody around here seem to know what they doing. Mr. Harrison watched him hurry off, then turned to Stacey, a look of piercing scrutiny in his eyes. You serious about working, boy? Why, yes, sir. Then I got a job. You want it? Whitewashing. About a week's worth, I figure. Pay you $5. Stacey was silenced by the offer. Well, you want it? I'll have to ask Mama. All right, I'm on my way home now. I'll drop y'all there, and you can ask her. Mr. Harrison took little Willie and Maynard as far as the north end of their farm, then continued to our place, where they hurried into the house while he waited in the car. We found Mama in the kitchen battering okra. She looked up smiling as we came in, but as soon as Stacey blurted out Mr. Harrison's job offer, her face grew solemn, and dropping a handful of the okra in the hot oil, she simply said, No. Ma'am? I said no. But Mama, Stacey, your papa's not leaving us 9 months out of the year, breaking his back on that railroad so you can go work on some white man's place. You've got land, 400 acres out there of your own to work, and if you want to work somewhere, then you work it. But Mama, we need that money. Mr. Harrison's horn blasted outside, and Mama looked around. That's Mr. Harrison, I explained. He brung us home. Mama frowned, then took off her apron and went outside with us following. At the car, Mr. Harrison said, That boy of yours here there tell you what I proposed to him? Mama nodded. He did, and we appreciate your offer, Mr. Harrison. But with David away, I really need Stacey here. There was a look in Mr. Harrison's eyes that said he recognized in Mama something he understood. Well, I was afraid of that. May get another boy from my place to do the work needs doing. Or maybe the Wiggins boy ain't going to worry about it, though, for the next few days. So you find you can spare Stacey at all, you send him on down. That's very kind of you, Mr. Harrison, but I don't think I'll be changing my mind. Well, you tell your Mama I said hello now. I'll do that. Mr. Harrison backed the car onto the road and headed west toward the plantation. Without thinking, I took it upon myself to say, "Well, there go that $5. Mama turned and looked at me. "What's that?" I met Mama's eyes and figured it was better not to repeat it. "Nothing." Her eyes burned with displeasure. "And what were you doing riding home with Mr. Harrison? Haven't I told you about riding with white folks? I better not catch you doing it again. You hear me?" Christopher John, little man, and I murmured a distinct, "Yes, ma'am." But Stacey turned from her without a word and started across the backyard. "Stacey," she said, "did you hear me?" Stacey turned and glared at her. I heard everything, and I figure you're wrong about that $5. We need that money, Mama. Much hard times we've been having with the cotton and everything, and then you not teaching, and Papa's leg getting broke. We can't hardly be talking about not working for the white folks. They the ones got the money. Then they the ones we gonna have to get it from." I thought Mama was going to walk up the drive and knock Stacey down for his insolence. She didn't. Instead, she patiently folded her arms and met his accusing gaze. "That may be, but it'll be quite a few years yet before I have you going out into that white man's world, bowing and scraping." "Papa don't bow and scrape." "No, but he has to bend. We all do, and the longer I can keep you from having to, the better I'll feel. The land, Stacey, that's more important than Mr. Harrison's or any other white man's $5. "Well, what do you think I want the money for? That $5 of Mr. Harrison's could have gone toward the land tax. Plenty boys my age work outside their place." "Well, plenty of boys don't have land of their own. You do." Stacey shook his head as if Mama could not possibly understand how it was with him. "I ain't no baby no more, Mama, and you gotta stop treating me like one. We need the money, and I figures to get me a job." "Oh, no," Mama said as Big Ma crossed the backyard from the garden. "Not as long as I have anything to say about it." "Then maybe you won't." Shocked, Christopher John, little man, and I stared in disbelief at Stacey. None of us had ever talked to Mama that way. Looking as though he were as shocked as the rest of us, Stacey glanced our way, then dashed across the yard toward the garden. Mama called after him, but he didn't stop. "Boy, don't you hear your Mama calling you?" Big Ma demanded as he went right past her. But he did not heed her either. "I hear my ears right. That boy sass you," Big Ma demanded of Mama. "Well, he done got too big for his britches round here. Needs a good whipping, that's what he needs." Mama stared after Stacey in silence. Christopher John, little man, and I kept our eyes on her, wondering what she would do next. "No," she finally said, and slowly walked up the stepping stones to the side door. "It's not a whipping he needs." She took one glance at Stacey's retreating figure. "It's David," she said, and went into the house. And that is the end of chapter 7. Until next time, may the Lord bless you and keep you. May he make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. May he lift up his countenance upon you and grant you his peace.